Hey everybody, on today's Signing Off, we have Senior VP of A&R from RCA Records, Mr. Jake Ottmann, who's been a friend of mine for about 25 years, managed my old band, signed me to my first publishing deal with EMI, and knows everything about the music business, and he's here with us today. Welcome, Jake.
Rico, my old friend, Rick Beato.
This is our most formal conversation that we're ever gonna have here. Because normally we're just yucking it up. So,
because you're an irreverent human being that I love. That's what I like best about you, man.
I am. You know I am. Anyways, I want to ask you about the music business here, because you know the music business better than anyone that I know. You're an insider and an outsider, which is really hard to accomplish because people that are hipsters like you, because you're a total outsider, yet you've been working in the music business for 25 years. So how do you accomplish that?
That's a good question. I always thought my biggest liability was that I had this entrepreneurial spirit. The good news about, or I'm not sure, I have some historical precedent now, so I can kind of maybe give you a little bit of insight, but some wisdom. Maybe I'm on the leading edge of wisdom, I guess. Maybe this entrepreneurial spirit of mine at first had me sort of unable to work in a system, and now over the course of 25 years, I've learned to, or I've been guided. I must say, I think I've got some great guidance from some great bosses to use the entrepreneurial spirit that I have and make it work within the context of a large corporation.
Well, you had a management company before, and you were the head of your own record label when we first met back in the mid-90s. Can you talk a little bit about that? Then you got into publishing. Why don't you give a little background on because you're new at RCA.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, at RCA Records, I'm brandy spanking new. I'm talking like 2.5 months. Yeah, I mean, I started off in the mailroom of Elektra Records. I always say the mailroom, but I was actually an assistant to a gentleman by the name of Barry Roberts, who did urban radio promotion. I was also an assistant to the pop guy, Eric Olson, and I'd answer their phones. I found myself mostly in the mailroom sending out CDs. It was vinyl, really, 12-inch vinyl for Barry, to record stores and in little record shops, trying to influence the charts, because Billboard really was working on sales, and they would do this kind of sales and chart position. There was no sound scan. There was no media base. This was all kind of like people calling. So you could sort of goose the charts, or at least in theory, by sending out free records cleaned to these small record shops, and then the ones that actually got a chance to report, which gave them a lot of power, they would report into Billboard, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I was in the mailroom constantly mailing out records, some promos, legit. Mostly, we were just sending out records, and that's what I was doing all day long. It was amazing. Barry was a bit of a tyrant because I was a bit of a space shot, and I probably needed a little tyranny. I probably needed a little more of a stick than a carrot. And, Barry used to scream and yell at me, and because I was also in a band. I did a John Peel session at that time, and I was in London, and there was no mobile phones, and I didn't even have enough money to call in and tell him like there was a snowstorm in London, which never happens. He thought it was bullshit. So I was doing a John Peel session in BBC One Studios. I still have the laminate here somewhere. I'll find it. Hold on. And a John Peel session doing for this band, The Thing, with my friend Jesse, and I can't find it. Dang. I'll find it. But anyway, he fired me, Anyway, so he was always screaming and yelling, and oh my God, you're such a bad assistant, So he actually fired me, and I wouldn't leave. And he was like, it was kind of awkward. He's like, you have to leave. I fired you, and I'm like, no, I don't have rich parents, you know what I mean? I was like, if you fire me, then I gotta go out and find another job. And I refused to leave, and we had this like kind of Mexican standoff, like, and then finally he's like, oh, and Barry is one of my dear friends to this day. I love him dearly. He gave me a second shot, and I think I took advantage of it. I ended up going from being an assistant to being really doing marketing for sales. So I was, I spent my first 4 years in the music business in record shops, marketing, record sales, the whole nine. And then I eventually got a job in that same area doing radio promotion for alternative radio. This is in the early 90s. This is post Nirvana, but it was that moment when alternative music, became everything, Sub Pop and all this stuff. And, Pearl Jam was just breaking, all these alternative rock, the alternative world had taken over. It had become an alternative world. So that's when I did radio promotion. And I wasn't long at that job when I realized I was miserable. And I hated radio promotion. I didn't want to do it. And the dream was starting to die for me as far as music business goes. And I'd given up being in a band. I wasn't very good, by the way. And so I just started my own record company. And I signed my friend, my college roommate, and he had a girlfriend, Meredith Chin, who's still in the business, who's an amazing person. I remember we were trying to find demos and putting out 7-inch vinyl, 7-inch records. We were doing 7 inches, I knew where to sell them because I was in record shops my whole career, Anyway, and as we were debating, his girlfriend's, hey, I have this friend who I used to smoke a lot of pot with. His name is Beck. I don't like that. That sucks. Anyway, so we ended up, well, whatever. There's nobody else. So we put out a Beck. We asked him to do it, and he did a 12-song or 10-song record called Western Harvest by Moonlight, which you can find online still. It's worth about $80. We called our company Finger Paint. So everybody finger painted their records. We'd lay out these big sheets of paper and they'd finger paint it. So there's, I don't have any of those vinyl anymore. They do. So we have a finger painted Beck 10-inch because there was so many records. That you can find them online. So that's how we started. And I quit. I ended up quitting when I got a demo by a band called Super Drag. And that's when I just said I can't do a radio promotion, one more phone call to a person that I just don't think really likes music anyway, these programmers and remembering birthdays and all this stuff that I just, I can't. I just wanted to be at shows. I thought A&R was an ivory tower, and I thought you were born into it. It was like you're either royalty or you're a peasant. And
sometimes people were born into it. They got it because one of their relatives were got them a job in it. That used to be there was a lot of that going on back at the time.
I think so. I just thought it was this insurmountable mountain that ivory tower that I would never get in. So anyway, I quit with Super Drag tape. Ironically, not long after I quit, I was sort of phasing out. I was, the next guy was taking over. And that's when the song Loser by Beck blew up. And it was like a meteorite that just struck the earth, that song. And all these programmers who I was now introducing my replacement were like, because I went around and I'd give everybody Beck records. I didn't know, it was like, who's this weird dude from LA that, and so like, as I was leaving, they're like, oh my God, this is a Beck record. Thank you so much. Like, wow, you must be really, and of course I was leaving. I was probably my one credible moment with the record programmers that maybe would have, but I just, that's, and I left with a demo tape and it was Super Drag. And we ended up having a really nice, not long after 1996, we had a song called Who Sucked Out the Feeling, which was a big hit, signed the band to Electric Records. So that's how I started. Another friend recommended me for a thing called Dedicated Records, Spiritualized, and a bunch of great bands and I took over that label. I was managing. When I got your demo tape, I started managing Billionaire. So I was kind of running a little label. I was doing management. I signed Beth Orton, which was a big A&R moment for us, this little label. She became kind of the it girl. That was crazy. And then there was a moment, not long after, I think around 1999, where Super Drag their second record kind of flopped, and Billionaire, I think you guys were you were getting dropped, and the label thing, Beth Orton wasn't a thing anymore, And I kind of was sort of ass out, as I like to say, in between hit songs, I guess. And I was really desperate for work. I had just gotten married, and I remember walking down the aisle, unemployed.
Right.
And that's how I got into publishing. EMI Music Publishing. Somebody took, Marty Bandier, believe it or not, who I rode the elevator with Sony today, who took a shot on me.
That was probably 2001, right? I think it was.
Yeah. Yeah. From there, I signed. I had it took me a minute, but I had some big hits. My biggest band I ever signed, my first deal that I ever did was Coheed and Cambria, who was one of the, I went back to my prog rock roots and signed them. And it was a huge bidding war. The record kind of tanked, but I mean, that band is still massive. They're almost an arena band at this point. One of the bigger bands I signed was The Fray. That turned into like a massive, 5-2 album, like multi-single hit, 100% controlled songs. We're talking, ubiquitous radio noise sounds of The Fray. It was
the first record. The Cable Car was a massively big hit.
Uh-huh.
Massively big hit.
Yeah, and they also had that song "How to Save a Life," which was
How to Save a Life. Yeah, and but you found that band before they even had their record deal, didn't you?
Yeah, they were signed. They were doing their own thing. I actually, I kind of went back to my original roots, record stores, and and I found they were selling at this little record store in Boulder. So, I've always used those roots I had. So, The Fray, and then I got into the big emo phase, and I signed a bunch of emo stuff, and had a lot of hits with the emo world, and then went to Warner Chappell, where I signed, a bunch of that stuff, a bunch of gold records there. I don't know.
There you go.
Melanie Martinez, I signed as a real outlier, didn't have a song recorded, and she's one of just like a juggernaut online media, social media, and album ticket selling juggernaut. Like, did that. I've always been a bit of a early developer guy. It kind of goes back to record stores, goes back to 7-inch or singles, and mailroom kind of grind. That's where I go. And I just signed here. I'm at RCA 3. Less than 100 days. I signed this band Missio, who has a song called Middle Fingers, which was I think a bona fide alternative radio hit. So that's been my band, my boys, Missio. Who I think really have the trap and alt rock kind of combination, really nailed that. So
which is difficult these days, right? The alt rock scene is very hard. The rock scene has been very hard for years.
Rock is I hate to say it, but I think for the most part, like your traditional. I mean, there's
always exceptions. Yeah, I know you're gonna say.
But, I mean, we're talking a Generation Z that really hasn't heard, the snap of a real drum. As I like to say, the rock combo. A rock combo there's no such thing, anymore. It's
right.
And it's alternative radio, which is, you look at the streaming numbers, it's fractional. Hip hop has become the new thing, and rock is the kind of fringy, weird. Alternative is super fringy. It's super out there. It's amazing.
What kind of things are people signing though? If they, people always ask me that, and then I say, I don't know, I have to call you. So I call you, and I always ask you what people are signing. It changes all the time. What are things that are happening now that people are interested in? What are you looking for example?
I mean, me personally, again, I'm looking under rocks. I'm looking for the I hate to use the term outliers. I've used it 4 times now, and I probably have said that, 6 times in my life, my whole time. I like to feel that I can see the woods through the trees, and I feel like I don't want to be a chaser. I just don't have the bandwidth in my brain to, what I feel? I'll be honest with you. I'm 25 years in this business. I've sold records. I've snuck into concerts all my life. Rocket. It's good because I say it's good. You know what I mean? That's just the way I have. I don't know if you want to call me a influencer. I'm not sure I am, but
no, you totally are. You totally are.
I mean, it's good because I say it's good, and that's just the way I believe it. You really have to be a data research, metadata kind of like, is the song. You have that at your fingertips now. which but I've always used an algorithm in my brain. Like I said, I went to record stores. Is that guy talking about it? It's still one person talking about a record.
Sure.
You know what I mean? It's still word of mouth. It's just a different, now we're talking on a talking telephone. You know what I mean? Like, we're the flying cars, by the way. So I think it's my own algorithm, and it's one that I've always used. So that's how I measure things. I have to like it, and I have to envision it as something that is bizarre. I grew up listening to Frank Zappa. I grew up listening to weird. I've always been
really eclectic. You have super eclectic tastes.
Yeah. I remember signing Coheed and Cambria at the time. It was like a disaster, sales-wise. But I mean, you look now, Long Tail. It's like that's when I'm super proud of that. I'll always be proud of that band, And the Fray too. The Fray is, they were at one point a really cool band. I could tell people like it, like in their little hometown, people were flipping out about this band. They thought it was the American Coldplay, So, I think you should be looking for urban hip hop is what you should be looking for. Really cool. Like, you're in Atlanta, the Atlanta kind of mumble hip hop. It's the new punk rock, That's why it's so exciting. Drake is the biggest. Drake, if you're under 12 years old, you don't know who Paul McCartney is. You might know because your parents listened to it when you were a little baby, but you listen to Drake, you listen to Drake and the Paul McCartney and John Lennon now, that's Biggie and Tupac. You know what I mean? And by the way, there was no Slingerling drum kit, that was an 808, So like, that's so, the tail has gone to that. I respect it. I love it. I think Biggie's one of the most punk rock, awesome, like, writers of all time. And I think if you're a musician, you might want to consider working on your programming for your song rather than like you got to play. You still got to be able to, crush. You still have to be clever with melody,
Yeah.
But I think, the other thing I love about hip hop is it's really taking lyrics to an incredible new, exciting level. The wordplay that is going on right now with these hip hop guys is incredible. And that means that if you're writing a rock song and you're writing about some corny, cliched lyric, you don't stand a chance, man. Right. You don't stand a chance because dudes like Chance, whatever, the wordplay that they're doing is so incredible that it's raised lyric and melody to such a new level. That's like the new shredding guitar, Eddie Van Halen, like the wordplay, your flow and all that stuff. I'm not like, I don't do hip hop. I'm not that guy, but that's the influence. So when I'm looking at an artist, and I think when anybody as an A&R person right now is looking at an artist, you got to be able to fit into this new kind of paradigm, which is incredible wordplay. Everything's very pop right now.
Well, has been for a while though.
Yeah. But when we were kids, it was super corny, but it's not anymore, really.
So I like to say that you have aesthetic aptitude. That's a term that I have for people that. It doesn't matter how old they are, they know what's hip. You could be Andy Wallace and 70 years old mixing a rock song, a heavy rock song, or you can be you that grew up with rock and roll and then knows what's cool in hip hop, even though you're 35 years old.
I think I've known you for like 35 years, man.
Right. But what do you think about that? You just have a knack for knowing what's cool. Well, even without, you don't have to even know the genre. You just you get a sense of what's cool, right? Of what people are gonna really feel.
Yeah, that is one of those weird little things. I think that's like what did you call it again?
Aesthetic aptitude. Like you just know. It doesn't matter how old you are. You just know it's cool.
Well, I think the trap as a person in music is. When I hear a guy say it was cooler back then I know, like, dude, you're done. You're out. And if you listen to like dudes like David Byrne and some of the real needle movers of our business, like they're still listening to the wackiest, coolest shit. I mean, Thurston Moore, I haven't seen him out. I don't go out as much as I used to, but you'd always see him at the coolest show. You know what I mean? Or Jay-Z is always like, you'll see Jay-Z, or used to, in very recent history, you'd see Jay-Z at like, these like at like a Dirty Projectors show in Brooklyn. I'm dating myself because even that's old to say that, but you know what I mean? Like, you see like the people who really keep it current, and they're out there doing it, and what I've always had a knack for is I don't have a lot of ego when it comes to music. I have super low self-esteem. So, I have no problem. At this point, I find people who are smarter than me, like, for instance, you. And I'm like, all right, that person is really cool. They know what the hell they're up to. And I've always had a knack for, I hate to call it people collecting because that's a super scary word, but like, you just see these kids come into my office and I'm like, that kid knows his shit. You know what I mean? And I'll be frank with them, just candid, like, listen. And I don't try to, I'm not trying to dress like a kid. I'm not trying to be a kid. I'm like, I'm a grown ass man and I love it. You know what I mean? And like, I like this. So I think if you can kind of keep your integrity and also be able to talk to a 25-year-old kid who like, some of these kids, they're just shot out of cannons, man. And they want it. They want it like I want it. And I think that's ultimately what, I had to find music. I had to find my way. If I didn't, music saved my life. There's no gray area about it. There's no gray bearded area about it. I'm like qualified to do nothing else. You know what I mean? But
lucky for you, right?
Yeah, but what I have been able to do is filter it through the 15. I always say, like, today I rode a city bike to work. I'm like I'm a 14-year-old getting to work, and I do a job of like a 16-year-old. You know what I mean? And like that 16-year-old boy in me is alive and well. He's alive and well. So I tend to like find people that can convey the right information for me. I think that's a big thing, one way that I'm able to do it. But I also I don't know, man, like, again, I think the 16-year-old to me never cared if it was punk rock. I always liked punk rock. That's kind of my aesthetic, mosh pits and stuff like that. I played guitar. I love guitar. But I think the 16-year-old in me loves to hear like a cool programmer too. I love that. I love going in the studio with hip hop guys. It's really, first of all, most of them learn how to play music in church. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So I love seeing guys that can cut and paste and program the shit. And like, it's virtuosic, like Eddie Van Halen, or Steve Vai,
I want you to talk for a minute about the influence of social media, things like YouTube, on what you do now and on record labels and A&R. Let's talk about that, because people want to know that. How important is that?
I'll take myself out of it for one moment. It's everything, Ironically, Melanie Martinez, who's probably, like I said, I'm one of my proudest signings, who
is massive on YouTube.
Doesn't even do. It's funny. She barely does social media. She posts very infrequent. It's just she knows what to post. She's very in touch with what her message and what to put out and how to like sort of fan the flames. Ironically, and she's one of the true juggernaut of social media. But ironically, she considers herself a musician, which is awesome. At any rate, it's very important. We live in I think the music business and the social media world it's just two, I believe it to be two universes, side by each, as we say in Maine, where I grew up. They're living side by each. And, those worlds occasionally orbit and cross orbit, and you'll see Shawn Mendes, who's I think the true products of that world, although a musician first and foremost. Bieber came to light because he was a super freaky musician first, social guy second. The one that I'm really in contact right now who fascinates me is a kid named Jacob Sartorius, who, if you have a daughter under the age of 14 years old, Jacob was a Viner. He's 12, like, just connected online on Vine, doing nothing. Now he's almost 15, and I just saw him at Webster Hall, sold out a show. Probably could have done 2 nights. did a whole set of his own music. So is he a Viner, or, is he Vine is dead? Is he a social media guy, or is he a musician now? So, I don't think the one does not guarantee the other. Cameron Dallas is a social media guy. There's a bazillion. Lauren Beach, I think, is a Musical.ly star. I don't know if the two, you can't guarantee to cross collateralize the two. I think ultimately you have to have the talent. Again, metrics is everything, but metrics on, I can sell Coca-Cola on my or whatever, I can post something on my social media and get paid for it. It does not necessarily transfer into being a musician.
But if you have a song that has 50 million views and you're an unsigned artist, that's somebody that a record label is going to look at. Agreed?
Yeah, you're always going to get the looks, but I can point to several artists who have 50 million streams, maybe more, who have not really tied. The record companies didn't come together. So, I think it goes back to the record store, dude, where you bought where you and I did. If someone's not saying to somebody that guy is amazing, like, you know what I mean?
Sure.
If they're
word of mouth,
it's just an integrity thing. If you are strictly, Americans, or we humans, we are a funny bunch. We will vote into office some curious choices and make some very strange things. However, we may be dumb, but we're not stupid. When it comes to music reaches a DNA level that there has to be an honesty and an integrity. It's just the way it is. And I feel, quite frankly, or I'm more interested in really finding that honesty and that integrity than finding 50 million streams on Spotify. That's me. But again, I can point to 5 people outside my door who'll be like, are an old cranky pants, and you don't know what you're talking about. Like, that dude's gonna be out of a gig in 5 minutes. Good news is the people to whom I report here are, honest to God, like, they're heads, man. They are like serious heads. And that is why I'm at RCA Records, God bless, because they're heads. And yes, they give a shit about metadata, but they also just want to be moved. And that's DNA. Does that make sense?
That's great. Yeah, totally. And the record deals nowadays are still, for the last how many years have they been 360 deals? When you sign a deal with a major record label, I mean, pretty much they're always going to be 360 deals now, correct?
It depends, it depends on how much it depends how many social media things, it depends how much power you have negotiating. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to always want to go 360. I'm going to always want to do a 360 deal. And that's only because as a guy who likes music, like, I'm fascinated with, I always say, like, I cannot wait until the band I have has 5 tractor trailers of production behind them. Like, that's the most exciting part. That's one of the most exciting parts, is like production, trusses and trusses and trusses, like, that's what, I don't want to give that up. I don't want to walk away from that, man. I don't want to be like watching that stuff drive by. Like, I love that stuff. So, and, but as a musician, you negotiate. Obviously, you want to keep as much of that as you can. I happen to be, again, the without using the metadata guy, I tend to be an early guy, and I always try to get as much 360 as I can.
So, if people that are watching this want to send you music, they better not.
Me?
Yes.
No, I'm like I said, man, I'm part of the proletariat masses, bro. Like, I came, I won't say I'm digging through record crates. That would be a total bullshit on my part. But I like my VIP. But no, I listen. I always listen to records. I listen to music, and if I don't, I have 2 people or 3 people that listen, are really, that I trust, whose ears. So no, I mean, here's the deal. I'll meet with anybody. You can ask me. I will meet with anybody. because that's who I am. I will meet with anybody.
Anyone I've ever set up a meeting with you, no matter what, I say, if I call you up and say, hey, will you take a meeting with this person? You always do. Always.
Yeah, I don't care how much you suck, man. I'm still gonna try to squeeze them, But listen. I mean, if you're coming to me with something that you don't, if I at this particular juncture at this job, I'm looking for mass marketing, major selling #1 hit records on pop radio. That's what I want.
Sure.
It may come in a really strange, twisted package, or I want something so bizarre and so scary and awesome. The great thing about the record business right now, it doesn't have to necessarily be based on top 40 radio. We wanted to get it there someday. Everybody wants to hit. I don't know who, people who say they don't want to hit. When you have a hit, you like having. Didn't you like having a hit? Come on, having a hit's great, right?
Yeah, not complaining.
Yeah, it is pretty awesome. But I mean, there's Melanie Martinez, for instance. Has not been on the radio, and she's doing amazing. So, but I think it has to appeal to your kids, friends of your kids. If it appeals to the disenfranchised youth out there, then I'd like to hear it. And if it has guitars and drums, that's cool too. That's about. I listen to everything. And I'll meet with anybody. I don't care. I shouted that out in an ASCAP meeting in front of 5,000 people one time. I'll meet with anybody.
I believe that. That is honestly the entire time I've known you. That's always been your mantra that you will. I'll meet with anybody, and then you taught me. I got to tell people that are watching this, that watch my show, that a lot of the lessons that you've taught me. Don't burn a relationship over a record. Jake Ottmann quote. I mean, there's so many that I can't even.
That's actually a quote of Dee Snider's brother. I'm spacing, who I used to deliver his mail to. Gosh, I can't remember his first name. He was a promo guy, and he taught me that. Dee Snider's, he's a good dude.
That was, that was one of the Jake Ottmann lessons. And for everybody that watches my show here, Jake is the guy that I call anytime I want to know anything. So. I call you at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night when I'm going to the grocery store, and what's going on? What's happening? Tell me what the latest thing is. And Jake would always tell me what kind of bands to, like what the scene was, and I've relied on you for 20 some odd years that we've known each other, and I really, really appreciate it. You know that you're my guy, and I appreciate you doing this today. This is I just talked to you this morning. And I said, hey, I want you to be on my show. I mentioned it to you before, and then you just hooked up your Skype and you said, okay, let's do it now.
Well, I'll tell you this one last anecdote, but at that ASCAP guy, it was like literally, I don't know, like a huge ballroom of people, and I'll meet with anybody. And some guy stood up, he's like, well, you didn't return my call. And I told him in front of 3,000 or how many people, I was like, yeah, because your song sucked.
Oh, by the way, I told the story on one of my shows about the day you called me with our sound scan of 43 records. and I was on the steps of the Capitol, and I said, and you said, you're not going to like it. And I was like, well, what? 43. I said, 43,000? You're like, no, 43. 4,300? You said, no, 40 plus 3. And I said,
yeah, that's a modest start, I must say.
I sure wasn't laughing at the time. I was in shock. You're like, you're not gonna like it. That was
one of my favorite stories about that is that's when you became a producer. Remember,
that's right.
We'd go to the studio, we'd wait all day for the producer, who it turns out was a little bit preoccupied with other things. And you were just like you just started producing your record,
Yeah.
And that's I'll say this about you, Rick. You're one of the most, you can pivot so fast. It's incredible. And forget about it. You're making us all look bad with your kids, but that's besides the point. You're beautiful kids. No, it's incredible, to be able to pivot like you have. And, I think you, like myself, that's what we do, I don't know. I don't see you doing anything else but music, bro. I got bad news for you. You know, like you're
I
kind
never want to do anything else, and in
of,
any form.
if you haven't seen Rick play guitar, I know he's a great keyboard player and all that. If you haven't seen Rick play guitar, and I've seen it from the mixing board, and what was that at the five points? What was that club?
Oh yeah, the point.
The point, Rick. I could watch you play guitar all day long. I love listening to you play guitar, bro. Amazing shredder.
I appreciate so much you being on, Jake, and keep me posted with stuff.
No problem, man.